In a world governed by fear, where doing the right thing brought punishment rather than reward, one man fought to hold onto his humanity. Not loudly, not with grand speeches or dramatic declarations, but quietly, persistently, and at enormous personal cost. That man was Ignacio Nacho Varga. He was not born a villain, nor did he hunger for power, wealth, or recognition. He didn't dream of running empires or commanding respect through violence. He stepped into a world of monsters not by ambition, but out of necessity, driven by the will to survive and, above all, by a love so deep and unconditional that it shaped every single decision he ever made. A love for his father, the one person whose safety meant more to him than his own life. From the moment he entered the orbit of the Salamanca cartel, Nacho understood instinctively that this was not a world that rewarded honesty or emotion. Every look carried meaning. Every word was a potential trap. Every silence could be interpreted as weakness or guilt. The men surrounding him, Hector, Lalo, Tuco, were not ordinary criminals with ordinary menace. They were forces of nature, volatile, unpredictable, and utterly without mercy. To simply exist around them was dangerous. To survive among them required something far beyond toughness or bravado. It required a mind sharp enough to read every room before the room had a chance to turn on you. It required patience that most people never develop, and a self-control that borders on superhuman. Intelligence was his armor. His moral compass, though battered and tested at every turn, was his guide. But the heaviest thing he ever carried, heavier than fear, heavier than guilt, heavier than the constant threat of death, was his devotion to his father. Every risk he took, every lie he told, every dangerous alliance he formed, every compromise he made with his own conscience had a single, unwavering goal: keeping his father safe from a world his father didn't even know existed. His father lived in a different reality, one of honest work, dignity, and quiet pride, and Nacho was determined at any cost to keep it that way. Surviving in that world wasn't simply about being clever, though cleverness was essential. It meant deception, manipulation, and playing roles that went against the grain of everything he believed in. It meant shaking hands with people he despised, laughing at things that disgusted him, and pretending loyalty to men he feared and resented. But Nacho managed something truly remarkable within all of that darkness. He navigated the entire operation without losing the core of who he was. He bent, but he did not break. He lied, but he never lost track of the charts of the truth inside himself. That required a different kind of courage. Not the loud, chest-beating courage of men like Tuco, but a quieter, harder, more enduring kind. One that doesn't announce itself, but burns steadily from within, day after day, through impossible circumstances. His relationship with his father looked deceptively simple from the outside. Warm, respectful, loving. A good son visiting his hard-working father, sharing meals, exchanging ordinary words. But underneath that ordinary surface was an invisible and architecture of sacrifice, secrecy, and desperate protection. Nacho smiled when he was breaking inside. He stayed composed and reassuring when panic would have been completely justified. He deflected questions, changed subjects, and carefully managed every interaction so that his father could remain in the peaceful world he deserved, unaware of the storm that was constantly gathering just outside their door. That kind of quiet heroism, unknown, unseen, unacknowledged, and unrecognized, defined who Nacho truly was more than anything else. It was not heroism performed for an audience. It was heroism practiced in private, sustained by love alone. As he moved further into the cartel's inner workings, the stakes escalated relentlessly. Hector, Salamancas' brutality was the stuff of legend. A man who had built his empire on cruelty and intimidation, and who demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Lalo's unpredictability made him arguably the most dangerous figure of all, charming on the surface, but capable of switching to lethal violence in the span of a heartbeat, always watching, always testing, always looking for the crack in someone's facade, and looming over everything, pulling strings from the shadows with ice-cold precision, was Gus Fring, a man whose calm exterior concealed a capacity for ruthlessness that was perhaps more terrifying precisely because it was so controlled. Nacho moved through all of these threats simultaneously, always balancing on the edge, never able to fully trust anyone, never able to let his guard down for even a moment. Yet through all of it, he moved with precision. He watched more than he spoke. He measured his words, his expressions, his reactions with extraordinary care. He understood that in this world, showing too much or too little of anything could be fatal. He had to appear loyal without being fully trusted, capable without being seen as a threat, and calm without appearing cold. It was a performance of extraordinary complexity, sustained under conditions of constant danger. And he pulled it off, not because he was naturally deceptive, but because his motivation in protecting his father was strong enough to fuel that level of sustained effort. He was not the most physically imposing presence in any room he entered, but his mind was always the sharpest thing there. That brilliance was deliberately invisible to most people around him. It had to be. In a world where intelligence was seen as a threat, advertising it would have been dangerous, so he kept it hidden, let others underestimate him, and used that underestimation as just another tool. His brilliance was only truly visible to those perceptive enough to notice what wasn't being said, to read the silences and the carefully chosen moments of restraint. The decision to tamper with Hector's medication stands as one of his most defining and morally complex moments in the entire story. It was not an act of revenge, cruelty, or personal satisfaction. It was a calculated move born of desperation and survival instinct, carefully planned and executed with precision. But it was also layered with moral weight. It was a choice to act against a man's body, to interfere with his health in ways that could have consequences Nacho couldn't fully predict. It demonstrated his resourcefulness, his nerve, and the sophisticated depth of his strategic thinking. But it also showed the impossible position he was in, forced to commit acts he would never have chosen freely, in service of goals that were fundamentally about protection and love rather than power or malice. Every quiet maneuver he made served that same larger purpose: protect his father, influence the dangerous players around him, maintain whatever degree of control was still possible in a situation that was always threatening to spiral beyond anyone's management. His sustained interactions with Lalo revealed perhaps more clearly than anything else just how extraordinary his capacity for composure under pressure truly was. Lalo was a predator who fed on weakness, who used charm and humor as weapons, who watched everyone around him for signs of disloyalty or deception. Being the object of Lalo's attention was one of the most dangerous places a person could be. And Nacho was there, consistently, for extended periods of time, knowing that Lalo suspected him, knowing that one wrong expression, one poorly chosen word, one moment of visible fear could end everything. Yet he studied Lalo's patterns, anticipated his moods, calibrated his responses with surgical precision. He survived those confrontations not through luck, not through brute force, but through an almost impossible level of psychological discipline and self-mastery. Still, that same intelligence that kept him alive came at a profound personal cost. It kept him in a permanent state of hypervigilance, unable to truly relax, unable to form real connections, unable to exist in any moment without calculating the angles. Every relationship was complicated by the need for secrecy. Every moment of apparent normalcy was shadowed by the awareness of what lay just beneath the surface. It was an extraordinarily lonely existence, carrying knowledge that no one else around him fully shared, playing a role so demanding that there was rarely space to simply be himself. The weight of that isolation, compounding over time, was its own kind of suffering. Gus Fring, himself perhaps the greatest practitioner of hidden intentions and layered strategy in the entire story, recognized something genuinely unusual in Nacho. Not ambition, not ruthless self-interest, not the hunger for dominance that motivated so many others, but something rarer and more valuable in the right circumstances. The capacity to think with absolute clarity and act with absolute precision when everything was on the line, combined with a moral core that paradoxically made him more reliable rather than less. Gus saw in Nacho a mind that operated on a different level, and he used it as he used everything in service of his own agenda. But the recognition was real. Nacho operated from the shadows, steering outcomes without seeking recognition, always aware of far more than those around him suspected. He was simultaneously a pawn in someone else's larger game and a quiet player running his own calculations beneath the surface. But the world offers no shelter for those who try to remain decent within it. That is perhaps the cruelest lesson of Nacho's story. Every smart move invited new dangers. Every protective act created new vulnerabilities. Every step forward in keeping his father safe was also, in some way, a step deeper into the trap that was slowly closing around him. The cartel world does not release people. It does not reward good intentions or acknowledge moral distinctions. It simply consumes. And the more capable you are, the more completely it consumes you. Yet even knowing this, even feeling the walls close in with increasing inevitability, Nacho didn't stop. He kept going, quietly and deliberately, making the best choices available to him within conditions that offered no good choices, and facing each day with composure, regardless of what it brought. The private moments between Nacho and his father, simple, unguarded, stripped of all pretense, were where the full weight of everything he was carrying became visible to those watching, even as his father remained unaware. These were not dramatic scenes. There were no speeches, no confessions, no cathartic revelations, just a son and his father sharing ordinary time together, with the audience understanding the extraordinary cost of maintaining that ordinariness. In those quiet moments, the mask came off just enough for us to see what lay beneath: the exhaustion, the love, the fear, the grief of a man who had given up his own freedom and safety in exchange for his father's peace of mind. His father never knew the full picture, never knew how close danger perpetually was, how much his son had sacrificed, how many impossible situations Nacho had navigated, specifically so that the old man could go about his honest, dignified life, undisturbed. And Nacho never told him. That silence was its own act of love, profound, painful, and utterly selfless. As the story moved toward its conclusion, the burdens multiplied and the room for maneuver narrowed to almost nothing. The alliances he had carefully maintained became more tangled and contradictory. The threats converged from multiple directions simultaneously. The margin for error, never large, effectively disappeared, and still he held his position, standing firm against Lalo's disorder, navigating Gus's manipulation, carrying the accumulated weight of years of impossible choices. Not because he had become numb to it, not because he had found some way to detach from the danger, but because the alternative was to abandon everything. Everything that had made all of it meaningful in the first place. Then came the end, the final convergence of every thread, every decision, every sacrifice, pulling tight into one irreversible, defining moment. He could have run. He had been offered paths out, moments where escape seemed possible. He could have surrendered fully to Gus's machinery and accepted the protection that came with complete compliance. He could have given the cartel what they wanted: names, information, betrayal, and bought himself more time. But every one of those paths led to the same destination: becoming someone his father would not recognize and would not want to. And that was the one thing Nacho could not accept. Not after everything. Not after all the years of careful, painful, costly effort to remain himself within conditions specifically designed to erase people like him. So he chose differently. He chose death on his own terms. A death that shielded his father from retaliation, that moved him as a target, that closed the loop in the only way that preserved everything he had fought to protect. And he faced that final moment not with despair, but with a kind of fierce, quiet clarity. He said what needed to be said. He refused to pretend otherwise. He walked into the end with his conscience intact and his identity uncompromised. And in doing so, he reclaimed the one freedom that the cartel world had spent years trying to take from him: the freedom to leave this world as exactly who he was. That final act was not defeat. It cannot honestly be scripted for him. I was as and she said this was aggressive baro prefer as abras a shavlet beside and rat said the dwarf ways a dough was stay further to dear says. There's the fullest and most complete expression of everything Nacho had always been, distilled into a single moment of irreversible choice. Not a king, not a conqueror, not a survivor in the conventional sense, but something arguably more valuable and certainly more rare. A man who, when the world demanded he become something ugly and hollow in order to keep breathing, looked at that offer and said no, clearly, finally, and without hesitation. His intelligence, his moral core, his love for his father, these were never weaknesses, though the world around him consistently treated them as such. They were the truest and most enduring parts of him, and they outlasted everything the cartel threw at him. They were the things that could not be beaten or manipulated or threatened out of existence, no matter how hard the world tried. And in the end, they were the only things that mattered. Nacho Varga didn't fail because he died. That framing misunderstands what failure and success meant in the context of his life and his values. He was failed by circumstances that gave him no honest path forward, failed by a world that had no use for people of his particular combination of intelligence and integrity, failed by systems of violence and power that grind down the decent and reward the ruthless. But he himself did not fail in choosing conscience when survival demanded otherwise, in maintaining his humanity when dehumanization would have been so much easier. He became something that none of the powerful, feared, and celebrated men around him ever managed to be: genuinely, unambiguously admirable. When we remember him, we don't remember just another criminal caught in an impossible situation, though that is also true. We remember a son who bore an unbearable weight for years without complaint and without recognition. We remember a man whose quiet brilliance and stubborn, unshakable goodness somehow survived in one of the darkest environments imaginable. We remember someone who loved when love was a liability, who cared when caring was dangerous, who maintained his essential humanity in a context specifically and relentlessly designed to destroy it. He deserved a different life. He deserved choices that weren't already foreclosed by circumstances beyond his control. He deserved a world that could recognize what he was and offer him something better than the impossible position he occupied. But what he gave us, he gave us his story, his example, his refusal to become what the world wanted and needed him to become. That does not disappear. It stays with us because it speaks to something most of us will never be tested on, but all of us want to believe we would honor: the willingness to remain ourselves fully and completely, even when the cost is everything. That is the legacy of Ignacio Nacho Varga, and that, in every possible sense, is why he deserved better.